Okay, so it took me a while today to find a game that was decent for either party, and I guess this is the closest I'm going to get. This was a pretty fun game. I start off as black, interestingly enough. So my opponent started off with queen's pawn to d4. I matched it by copying. He moves with his kingside knight, so I match up with my queenside knight. He moves his e3, move his pawn to e3. I move g6. He moves to his white bishop to d3. So I move my black bishop to f7. He castles very oddly quickly, and so I go ahead and pin this knight here, because moving it would mean a loss of the queen. And so he threatens my bishop. So I take. He takes with his queen. And so I move my knight to b4, threatening this bishop. He goes ahead and moves his knight to c3, pawn to e6. And so he's going to start putting some middle ground pressure with his e-pawn. And so I take, he takes with the bishop, and I move my pawn up to protect it from being taken, this one from being taken. He moves his pawn, so I take because it is double protected, so he cannot take back, even though he does, and so I take back, putting me up 2 points. Of course, after he takes with his rook, knight. So I take here on c2 because he, by moving that bishop, he officially left this rook completely open. So he either moves it or he loses it. He chooses to lose it because he moves his knight to f6, so I have to take it. And he then moves his bishop to e3. So he was completely unaware that I was threatening this rook, so I go ahead and take it. He takes back, and I move my pawn on the b square up 1 to protect it, this one. The queen now has vision on the rook, but is protected by the queen as of now. So he attempts to threaten my queen with his rook, so I just move that over to the c file. He checks with queen, and so he's probably expecting me to try and move it back here, but I just end up moving my knight over to protect it. He tries a trade of bishops. I accept, and he takes with his queen, now double stacking the d file with a rook and a queen. I go ahead and castle, with giving me a little more defense on this area over here. He moves his queen to e4, putting threat on the rook. So I just move my rook right here because I want to move my knight out of the way while also threatening the queen. He moves his rook right there. And so, in hindsight, what I should have done here is I should have moved my knight right here. That way, if he chose to take the rook, I would take with my queen. And if he chose to duck out of the way, I would have his rook. But instead, I put him in check with black queen. And he moves it back. I put him in check again, and he moves his pawn. From here, this is when I do the little trick where I move my knight over here. If he takes, pawn takes. If he takes, rook takes. And if he moves out of the way, knight takes, rook. So he didn't really have much of a choice. He moved his rook out of the way, threatening my queen. So I ended up making it a trade of queens, which is something that I did not see in the game. But it ended up being in my favor because of trade, and I was 8 points up at this point. And so I go ahead and begin my pawn hunt here. He gets my knight because of just some misplay. I start setting up. He defends because I was threatening mate here. So I take back, and I start pushing up this pawn. He starts moving his king over. So I try to stop him from getting close to his rook, because then it's a lot easier to stop mate. So he threatens, he offers a trade of rooks. I say no and move to the d file. He moves his last remaining pawn, trying to get as many moves in as possible before it becomes too difficult. I threaten his rook here, and so he has to move that out of the way. He does so right there, and so I put him in check. He moves his king. He can't take this pawn because it's protected by this rook, so I go ahead and promote to queen. And at this point, it's just simple chess, and it's over.